Hi everyone, welcome to lesson 16 called Trust. The memory verse is Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not in your own understandings. In all your ways submit to him and he will make your paths straight. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. I originally learned that in all your ways acknowledge him and he will make your path straight. But the newer version, the NIV, and it says, in all your ways, submit to him. And I actually prefer that translation because acknowledge him, it could be kind of one of those, yeah, I acknowledge that, I hear that. But submit to him, that's, for me, it's a different message. So I prefer that translation. The big idea for this lesson, I wrote to submit and surrender to God. He knows it all, so why go anywhere else? Submit and surrender to God. He knows it all, so why go anywhere else? The core truth, some of the phrases that stood out to me is just as you received Christ, and then continue to live in him. So I just wrote, by faith, you surrendered your life to God. Don't try to take it back. Keep trusting God. So I like that. So just as you received Christ, right? In that moment, we recognize our need for Jesus. We surrendered all. But now continue to live in him. Right? Keep trusting God. Keep your life surrendered. Don't take it back. So I like that phrase. Memory verse study guide. We were looking at Proverbs 3, 1 to 10. And in question 1, I'd asked what themes you discovered there. And I found lots. In verse 1, the theme of teachability, which is also in verse 7, just being teachable. Also in verse 1, obedience. Verse 2, you have life longevity. You have peace and prosperity. Verses 9 and 10, you also have prosperity. Verses 3 and 4, to establish and grow, ways to establish and grow a healthy relationship. Verses 5 and 6, direction for life. And then verses 7 and 8, we mentioned teachability in 7, but also healthy living, what that looks like. Question 5 in that section, what's the importance of the qualifier, in all your ways acknowledge him, in verse 6, or in all your ways submit to him. And I wrote, we are not just to seek God and his direction for our lives. I just acknowledge it. We're to do more than that. We are to surrender to him and his way. Question 6, what is the promised outcome? What does this mean? And I wrote, God will make a way for his will to be accomplished. It does not mean that life will be easy and without obstacles. But God will provide. It may look different from what we had hoped for, but God will provide. And then we looked at Hebrews 11 for the inductive Bible study guide. Great passage. Right? The Hall of Faith. The writer wrote, Hebrews 11 is often called the Hall of Fame of Faith because it catalogs the faithfulness of the great ones who have gone before us. Allow their sense of adventure in following wherever God would lead to enhance your sense of anticipation and risk. I like that phrase, to enhance your sense of anticipation and risk. That's good. That's just us being mindful that God is at work in our lives and in those around us. So what's next? What's going to happen? I wonder what this day is going to look like. So number 1, rewrite in your own words the definition of faith. I wrote, faith is confidence that God will provide even when it seems impossible. Skipping into question 3, what are the common elements in the faith of the heroes listed? I wrote they trusted God, They obeyed God. They stepped out in faith. They had confidence in God. And they did not necessarily see the finish line, but they believed God anyway. Number 4, with which of these heroes of faith can you most identify, and why? I said Abraham from verse 8. And I just told the story to my guys of when I quit my job at a church. I was working on the West Coast based on God's leading. Really believed we needed to be on the East Coast. But the next job, we couldn't find a job on the East Coast, but the next job opportunity was actually in California. So we were living in Washington, but we moved to California, and we had this real sense that although we were moving south geographically, we were really moving east emotionally. We sensed that this church in California, it was a large church, well networked in terms of being able to meet other potential teammates and such. We sensed that this was going to be a way we would get to the East Coast. And that's what happened. We ended up planning a church in New York City after leaving this California church. Question 5, how are you challenged by the faith of these heroes? And I wrote, they had to overcome great obstacles and challenges. Their faith was not an easy American Christianity. So it's a good reminder for some of the trials and challenges I face that I don't want to disregard or ignore them, but they're kind of laughable and compared to what some of these heroes of the faith had to experience. Again, you don't want to minimize our pain or someone else's, but it's good to be reminded what these Bible heroes have gone through and what others in the world, in our own world or around the world are going through. This reading was terrific. God works everything together for good. So let's take a look at question number 1. How has the promise that God works all things for good been misused? That's a great question. I wrote, people intend to use the phrase as a way to encourage others, but it's often stated without care, without intending to be present and available to those in pain. It's not true all the time. It is a truth that God works all things for good, right, for those who know and trust in Jesus. But sometimes I think people just throw that out there as kind of a pat on the back, when in reality, it's whatever they're going through. It's an invitation for us to be present in their lives, to be with them, to share in their pain. So I think it can be misused that way. Number 2, why would the promise that God works everything together for good be limited to those who love Him and have been called according to His purpose? I wrote, those who surrender to God and obey Him show that they love God. And those who willingly submit to God's authority will be molded into the image of Christ. So it just comes down to, are we truly submitting our lives to God? Are we surrendered to Him? If that's the case, then God will work everything together for good. And number 3, how does the knowledge of God's goodness address Jerry Sitzer's tragedy? Wow, that was an incredible story. I appreciated the author sharing that. I wrote that nothing is arbitrary. God has a plan for all things, even though we may never understand it. Question 4, I'm not going to go through this, but this is a great one to share with your group. Share a story from your life in which you've gained perspective in those 3 different areas. You can focus on one. I jotted something small for each of those areas, but that's a great one to discuss. Question 5, how does verse 28 rest on the foundation of verses 29 and 30? Verse 29, for those God foreknew, He also predestined to be conformed to the image of His Son, that He might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. Verse 30, and those he predestined, he also called. Those he called, he also justified. Those he justified, he also glorified. So I wrote, everything that happens in life, verse 28, is based upon the eternal love and purposes of God. So that's just a great way. I love the question, how does verse 28 rest on the foundation of 29 and 30? And everything's based on the eternal love and purpose of God. Bottom line. Number 6, what comfort do you find for yourself in the closing quote from J.I. Packer? And I wrote, it's a tremendous reminder that we are loved by God. Just as God used the cross to bring about the salvation for humanity, I can trust that God is using all things in my life. We are loved by God. We are not forgotten by God. He is with us, and He is using all things. So the big idea for lesson 16 on the topic of trust: submit and surrender to God. He knows it all, so why go anywhere else? Have a great discussion. Thanks.